More than 8 decades since its first radio broadcasts, the SABC is a part of South Africa's soul. Over the past decades, the public broadcaster has evolved from an exclusively broadcast service to a modern multimedia content platform.
SABC has obviously evolved over the decades, and when it was first established in 1936, it was established by an act of parliament as a radio service, broadcast service, and it was actually purchased from a private owner. There were 3 existing radio stations. That was obviously just pre the war, and as you know that in 1939 the war broke out. So a lot of the broadcasts were also support. South Africa was supporting the war, the World War II, and quite a lot of the broadcasts were actually propagating the war. In fact, the first broadcasts in African languages, which was Zulu, Xhosa, and I think Sotho, were actually in 1940, in the middle of the war. So post the war, then the radio stations were then established. I think it was 1960 by then that they had African radio stations actually established. But effectively, it emerged as a state-owned broadcaster serving the state.
We've come a long way as the SABC. We've been able to deliver on our mandate, which is to educate, inform, and entertain. And we've done a lot really in transforming the SABC and make SABC truly independent and impartial and fulfill our public mandate without any fear, without any unquestionable or questionable behavior, so to speak.
The SABC has served varied roles for different government arrangements, including the tumultuous apartheid era.
I remember we had different lifts, blacks and whites. We could not use the same lift even if we were going to the canteen, because even for starters, the canteen, there was a white canteen and a black canteen. The reception, there was a black reception and a white reception. So our reception, which was then called Bantu Onfangs, meaning in English, black reception. There was a white guy, a security guy who used to work there. He was even called his name Bantu Man, to search us when we go in and go out, to see if we have not stolen anything from the library. It was an abnormal situation, which was normal at the time. But we worked because there's nothing that we could do. We wanted to do our work, and we eventually joined the TV when they started TV 1, 2, and 3. And that was when it was broadcasting in our languages. It was quite an experience to see ourselves working under those circumstances.
For many journalists, the public broadcaster has been home for decades.
I never imagined that I would stay at the SABC for 28 years. I started on the 1st of August 1992. I'd come from Namibia at a time of independence, working with a state broadcaster, transforming it to a public broadcaster, and I didn't really want to go through that again. But it was my destiny, and I kind of gave myself 3 years, and then came the Truth Commission, and that was another 8 years, and then came the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the Racism Conference, all the elections, working on profiles, working in the field, mainly doing politics. It had started with covering the violence on the East Strand in the early 90s, all the way through to what I still regard as the magnum opus, working towards Nelson Mandela's death. And I know it's a touchy subject, but broadcasters have to do this. And working in all our languages. And 28 years later, I find myself here working predominantly with Radio Current Affairs. We've got 14 teams across the country. We broadcast in 13 languages. And I think we do amazing work despite the difficulties. I'm
an award-winning journalist today because of the SABC and the trust that they had in myself as a scrawny little 19-year-old coming from Pietermaritzburg in the Midlands of KwaZulu-Natal. In the year 2000, I found myself having covered the Olympic Games in Sydney, Australia. A couple of years thereafter, I found myself to have covered 5 Olympic Games, South African Journalist of the Year 2016, and many other accolades.
In the modern SABC, where we used to do a lot of traveling, I remember one story that we did the Quito Carnival, tracing the war between the Cubans and the ANC and the Angolans, that type of war. The area which we drove at, full of landmines. I remember one day when we were driving there, myself and Herbert was the camera guy at the time, and I was to drive through sort of a river, but they had to check if there are no landmines, because every time they went through, there would be a blip which shows there's no landmine. Driving through that, I was sweating, and Herbert was also shaking. But we worked and we sent the story.
While the public broadcaster may be riddled with financial difficulties, there's hope that the SABC can reinvent itself.
One of the things that we can expect, that the public can expect from the SABC, is us becoming financially viable and sustainable, and being able to stand on our own and make sure that we are able to fulfill our mandate fully. One of the things we're looking at having SABC everywhere for everyone.
The public has to take ownership of the public broadcaster. Government has to commit public funds to the public broadcaster. It has to be managed properly. We need to look at the funding model for the public broadcaster. We can't continue and also commercializing this space, because it begins to taint so much of why we exist, why we came into being as the public broadcaster, what we are designed and destined to do. So if we get that right, I'm not saying we mustn't downsize, that we mustn't change and restructure. We've just got to do it properly.
84 years on, and the SABC has grown from humble beginnings to boast 18 radio stations and a plethora of television and digital platforms. Hasina Gori, SABC News, Johannesburg.